Hello, welcome to our live Q&A about poverty in America. My name is Katy Bailes. I'm a video journalist here at The Economist. I'm going to be joined by Idrees Kahloon, who is The Economist's US policy correspondent. He's in Washington, DC. I'm in London, where The Economist's main editorial hub is. Hey, Idrees, are you on the line?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, cool. So for the next 20 minutes, we're going to be talking about poverty in America, what poverty in America looks like, what political measures are in place to fight it, and ahead of the US 2020 election, what politicians are saying about it. Idrees has actually just written a special report on poverty in America, which if you tap the I at the top of your screen, you'll be able to read. You'll also be able to access the films that we've made on the same topic. Okay, so I guess my first question for you, Idrees, would be, obviously you've just written this report about poverty. What inspired you to tackle this topic right now?
There were two reasons, really. One is personal and the other was professional. I grew up in Kentucky. My dad was a cardiologist in the eastern part of the state, which, as you may know, is one of the poorer parts of America. So growing up, we would always hear stories about his patients and the kinds of things that he would have to just see. You know, he's a heart doctor, so he would see a 60-year-old woman, for example, who'd have to come into the to get a procedure with a 5- and 6-year-old kid, and he would just ask, why do you have your grandkids with you? And they would say things like, "Mom and Dad are in jail because of drugs," or other sorts of things. Just like very, very kind of sad stories that you just hear little bits about. And the second part of it was professional, was that I had been doing this job out of DC, writing about domestic policy for about 2 years. And all the things that I covered, things like education and healthcare and the changing politics and what it was like to be a low-wage worker, I felt like I was slicing off aspects of poverty without necessarily taking it on as a whole. And so the special report was an attempt to try and holistically tackle a gargantuan subject and try to kind of distill what we know about what is changing about poverty in America.
Great, yeah, and you did a really great job. It's a really good read.
Thank you.
Okay, so now it's time to take some questions. We've got questions from our community tab on YouTube, but we're also going to be taking some live ones. So I guess a good place to start would be to give us an explanation of how people in such a rich country with such a strong economy are able to live in poverty. And we have a question from Hoang Vu, who asks, why are people still in poverty despite the low unemployment rate?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the way to think about it is to note that, as the report mentions, children are overrepresented among those people who are poor. So working age adults are a bare majority of the number of people who are poor in America today. That's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is that the unemployment rate is a fraction of unemployed people out of those who are in the labor force. It doesn't include people who are not in the labor force. So a lot of working age people who are counting as poor are in the category of disabled. About a fifth of those people who are poor and working age are disabled. And so that kind of gives you a small fraction of people who this might be relevant to. And we know that there are a fair amount of those people who are working part-time, not full-time. And so that suggests that either their wages are low or they're not able to find large amounts of work. And among the working poor, people who are working and still below the poverty line, they tend to be concentrated in a few industries, things like construction and retail and all the rest. But the general point that the macroeconomy is basically as good as it could be and poverty still remains relatively high, I think suggests that the two are not quite as tethered as we think that they might be. And I think that one reason that might be worrying is that if there is a recession, I think we have good evidence to suggest that recessions hit hardest among those on the lower ends of the income distribution. And so you could see a kind of more extreme response if things do turn south.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So we're also getting some questions about how poverty in America is different from what it might look like in other places around the world. Can you explain how poverty might look different in the US compared to other countries in other places?
Yeah. So one thing to keep in mind is that the way that we assess poverty and compare it to different countries is through a measure called relative poverty. Generally, that's something like you compare the number of people who have less than 50% of median income, and you look at that share and how it differs from place to place. Some people critique that measure because obviously, if you have a richer country, the median income is going to be higher, and so more people could fall under that line. So I think that that's a caveat to keep in mind that when we're doing international comparisons, we're using those kinds of measurements. But if you do look at those, what you do see is that America starts out with a share of poor people that is not especially high compared to developed countries. So if you look at the poverty rate before taxes and transfers kick in, it's about median-ish. But the thing that's unique about America is that after taxes and transfers kick in, the poverty rate doesn't move quite as much as it does in other places. And so the effective poverty rate, after you take into account government programs and services, remains relatively high, and it's one of the highest within the OECD countries, which are basically kind of a group of developed countries that we have pretty good data on. So that's kind of the broad explanation for what's going on. And as the special report makes focuses on, this is especially true for children who are living in poverty, which I think is problematic because of the kind of long-run intergenerational consequences that could have.
Yeah, I mean, measuring poverty in America is a film in itself, well, a special report in itself, isn't it? It's a bit of a, it's like you open a can of worms when you even, think about that topic. So really
it's not only a really technical topic, but it's also very important to understand in order to figure out what exactly is going on.
Yeah, and absolutely, that poverty is measured differently in different countries. So yeah. Okay, so next question. So something that you talk about in your special report and something that we looked at in the films is the way that Canada has managed to roll out a system of universal child benefits. Can you tell us a bit about that, and would something like that be possible in America?
Yeah, so Canada's system is, I think, concentrated among. I don't think it's quite universal, but it goes quite a bit away. But the point being that Canada instituted a system of basically universal cash or close to universal cash payments, and we saw that the child poverty rate fell by a third in Canada. There is a comparable program that exists in America called the Child Tax Credit, but that's dispersed yearly, and it's not nearly as big as the Canada example. What we do know is that a larger child allowance in America would probably significantly dent child poverty here. Depending on how high you set it, you could see reductions of about a third to a half in overall poverty, and also a significant decline in so-called deep poverty, which is where people live below 50% of the poverty thresholds as well. So the example from Canada is that I believe that they implemented it 3 years ago, and they saw a pretty significant decline of about 33% for a country that is not too dissimilar from America.
Yeah, I mean that's huge, isn't it? That's a huge decrease.
So, sorry, I can't really hear you.
Oh, I think we're having a technical problem. Idrees can't hear me.
Here, let me try to.
Can you hear me now, Idrees? Sorry, we're just having a technical problem. Hey, can you hear me, Idrees? We're just figuring it out. I can hear you. Can you hear me? Okay, just one. Oh, okay. Sorry, guys. We're just trying to. Okay. 1 minute. Looks like Idrees is having some internet problems over there in America. So we're going to have to go offline, but we'll hopefully be back soon. Hey, sorry about that, guys. We just had a few technical problems. One sec, I just have to... Okay, right, thanks for staying with us. Okay, so let's get to the second bit, so solutions. We've covered the problem in a bit more detail now. Thanks for answering those questions, Idrees. But we've also had a few questions about what can be done about it.
Yeah.
So we've got a question from Benedict Neo, who asked, will taxing the rich be the solution?
It can be one of the solutions. I think that the special report points to the importance of a child allowance, and that's a relatively small anti-poverty intervention that could probably be funded out of general revenues as they exist now. That's not to say that you can't change the way that taxation works in America, but there are policies that promote the well-being of children and that increase integration as well, that I don't think require extensive amounts of revenue raising to fund.
Okay, cool. So another issue that a few people have brought up, which is worth talking about, one of them was David Johnson. He said simply, don't have kids. Do you have a response to this argument that people should be having fewer kids?
So I think that whether or not you tell people to have kids, and we know that there are poor children who exist here and now, who are not going away, even if you tell their parents that they shouldn't have been had in the first place. And we know a lot about their life outcomes and how they could be meaningfully changed if we were to improve things for them. And so I think that you have to take the issue as a given, and I don't think that proposition really will move you very far.
Okay, great. Thanks, Idrees. So the next question is a bit more technical. Pablo Izurieta has commented asking for a comparison between universal basic income and negative income tax. Can you delve into that?
Sure. Universal basic income essentially gives every adult a similar amount of money that's dispersed every year. A negative income tax is less universal, is more means tested, and essentially guarantees a minimum income for people. In terms of their ability to fight poverty, I think one of the issues that you might run into with the widespread UBI example is that the amounts that are dispersed have to go through the entire population. And so giving an amount that might be sufficient to avoid a life of poverty will require just vast expenditures. If you try and guarantee some minimum level, say the poverty line, but you do it through a negative income tax, meaning that not everyone, including the richest people in the country, get some, then it might be more effective. But there is a strain of thinking that if we were to have a UBI, that we could replace the anti-poverty programs that exist. And I think that's one reason why it appeals to some libertarians in the country as well. I worry that there are going to be some people who probably will need more than what the UBI maximum benefit would be. And so in those cases, it might be a problem for them.
Okay, and slightly related to that, Luke Kipri asked, if the best way of spending money on helping the poor is the best way of spending money on the poor to give them money?
I think we know that it's probably the most effective way to change their lives, but the problem comes from political economy. We know that people are reluctant to programs essentially that give cash to poor people are run into political headwinds quite quickly because people do not feel that that's an effective use of money. And so one reason why people suggest universal programs is that the universal programs in America, like Social Security and Medicare, are pretty close to beloved, while welfare programs or safety net programs like food stamps are much more suspect.
So even though we have a pretty good idea that direct cash transfers probably do the most for the lives of poor people, the problem comes from the interaction with public opinion and politics in terms of why that might not be the ideal solution for a lot of it. And America's safety net as a whole right now is one that has moved away from direct cash transfers to people. It is much more centered around work, whether through the earned income tax credit, which basically tops up wages, or it's in-kind contributions, things like food stamps, which you can trade in for cash directly, or Medicaid, which just provides health insurance. There's relatively little that the government does in terms of just directly giving cash to people.
Okay, great. And the next question is from Milan Prasad. Why do some governments try to give fish to the people instead of a fishing rod to eliminate poverty? So I guess what he's getting at here is similar to the argument made by some Republicans that people should be given the means to get themselves out of poverty, not just money. What do you think about that argument?
Look, no one disagrees that the ideal route out for poverty for people would be well-paid private sector employment. No one on either side of the political aisle in America thinks that the best solution is for people to rely on government benefits for the rest of their life. And the problem becomes that it's hard to get people. One of the central observations of the special report is that the older people get, the harder it is to tailor interventions that seem to meaningfully improve their lives. So one of the things that the report goes into is worker retraining programs, and they're kind of not very great returns. So these are, for example, attempts to give people fishing rods. And maybe the programs are poorly designed. Maybe the government is not that well equipped to do workforce training or workforce development. But the returns have not been so great. On the other hand, we do know that interventions to improve the lives of children, whether through education or moving them to better neighborhoods or the like, you do see dramatic impacts. I mean, really, really high cost-benefit analyses because of improved wages, improved schooling, reduced criminality, and the like. So I don't think that that the current program is one that gives fish as opposed to fishing rods. It's more of a matter of you have to take, again, the problem is given. And if you have a situation in which people legitimately do not have enough to eat, is your option to give them food stamps, which is about $200 of nutrition assistance, or do you tell them to get a job? I mean, that simplifies it radically, but I think that that you have to, again, take the problem as given.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. And we've just got another live question come in from Black Vito, and he's brought something up that you discussed in your special report and the kind of the racial elements of poverty in the States. So his question is, does solving poverty in the Black, or will solving poverty in the Black community require a different solution to other communities?
So I don't know if that's directly a question about reparations, but let me just say I think that the solution to reducing poverty looks identical for people of different races, that you can largely erode it through race-neutral means, the kinds that I talk about in the report, things like a universal child allowance, things like making sure that the poor are not increasingly concentrated in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, because that has so many deleterious effects to their children in terms of their schooling, in terms of their exposure to violence and all the rest. So I think that it's one of those things where if you concentrate on what we know will probably make the most impact and see what happens, I think that you would see a huge dent in the poverty rates for people of all races, whether it's white or Black or Hispanic or Native American. Whether anything special is needed is, I think, a subject of hot political debate in America, basically around should be up to the descendants of slaves that exist right now. I think it's something that, Democrats are kind of talking about or edging towards, but they're not fully willing to get on board. And the political reality of it is, of course, it's quite unlikely to attract any Republican support in Congress.
Yeah, it's quite a hot topic right now, isn't it? operations. Yeah. Okay, so that kind of nicely, in a way or not a way, brings us on to kind of the politics of poverty. And one of the things that people have been talking about is Andrew Yang and his universal basic income, which he calls a freedom dividend.
Yeah.
I know you interviewed Andrew Yang earlier this year.
Yeah.
How would his policy of universal basic income work?
So that would give 10,000, or I'm sorry, I think it's 1,000 a month to every adult in America. And when you ask him about whether or not this would come at the expense of the safety net programs that exist, his answer was that you would be able to select either the universal benefit or the safety net programs as they exist, which is interesting, and it's not something that I had encountered before. But I think that one of the potential problems with a UBI-like solution is that giving $10,000 or $12,000 to every adult in America costs something like $3.4-ish trillion a year, which is about 75% of the current federal budget. It is quite a lot of money that I think limits your ability to do all sorts of other things as well. And in terms of the anti-poverty impact of the UBI is obviously going to be much more diffuse than a targeted program, right? Because you're having to give a lot of money to a lot of people. So I don't know that it certainly would not have the greatest impact on reducing poverty in America than some of the other more targeted programs would.
Yeah. And so how are other Democratic candidates looking to tackle the problem of poverty and income inequality? Are they talking about it much at the moment in their campaigns?
Among the high-profile Democrats, and I think this is interesting, I don't think that poverty is a very big issue, at least in what they talk about. I think that the focus of the main contenders for the Democratic nomination are much more focused on the plight of the middle class. So that's why you see things like the robust debate around free public college and the cancellation of student debt, which obviously affects middle-class Americans much more than it does poor people who do not attend college. And to focus on things like Medicare for All, which again is a universal program. Obviously that would help some poor people, but it's much more tailored to the entire population as a whole. And I think that it's interesting that Democrats, particularly Lyndon Johnson and Robert Kennedy, used to be quite focused on the problem of poverty. And there's, I think, less focus on it now. Part of that is, I think, because poor people don't vote very much to begin with. There aren't as many of them as there are the middle class. That's one reality of it. The second is, I think, this persistent question of desert in America and the fact that the middle class are seen as kind of working and deserving of governmental intervention that helps them. Whereas when dealing with poor people in America, there's this constant need to make sure that you are sorting the deserving poor from the undeserving poor, and any attempt to kind of talk about how to improve their lives, I think, quickly runs into that question. And I think you've seen some of that on the comments today, for example. Why don't we just teach them how to fish instead of giving them fish? So basically, any discussion of it just quickly runs into that set of arguments, and it's one that's also quite difficult to unwind because people are quite set in their opinions, and it's hard to kind of break in. So I think for all those reasons, it's not been a prominent part of the Democratic debate so far. The only candidate who I will mention is Michael Bennet, who's not doing so well in polls right now, but he has proposed a universal child allowance like the one that I suggest in the report. Obviously, he's not a mainstream candidate, but I do think that there is at least one who's tackling this issue head on.
Yeah, and obviously we can't talk about American politics today without mentioning Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the Republican Party's approach to income inequality and the fight against poverty?
Well, I don't know that it's an issue that the president takes a personal interest in, but we can see the actions of his administration over the last 3 years, and they haven't done too much. What we have seen is that for Medicaid, which is the health insurance program for the poor, They've tried to roll out work requirements for those in a couple of states. Courts have undone that now because there were basically thousands of people who were losing their health coverage for failure to fill out some of the paperwork involved. And there was a scheme that was suggested where food stamps would be replaced by a blue apron-like service where the government would send packages of dried goods and such to people rather than giving them cards that they could use to buy things at supermarkets. You haven't seen very much, and I don't think that it's a great focus of the Republican Party, which I think tracks. I don't think that it's an unusual aspect of the Donald Trump administration. I think it's one that you would have seen probably with any of the Republicans who were running in 2016 had they come into office, that they would probably have operated in much the same way as Trump has. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're running out of time now, Idrees, and I know that you've got to run to get your flight to Chicago.
Yeah.
That's all now for the Q&A. Thanks, Idrees. We'll see you next time.
Okay, thanks a lot for having me on.
Thank you. And if you would like I said before, if you would like to read Idrees's report on poverty in America, please click the eye at the top of the screen, where you will also get to watch our films. Thank you so much for sending in all your questions. They were really interesting. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and we will be doing one of these again soon. Okay, thank you. Bye.